Hello, this is going to be the first of three videos to talk about fundamental principles for understanding pre-modern societies. When we say pre-modern, we're thinking on a timeline. In Western civilization or in European history, however you want to define it, we usually split time up into three broad periods. There's the ancient world, going down to about 500 AD, that's about when the Roman Empire breaks up. Then the medieval world, or Middle Ages, from about 500 down to 1500 AD. That's a spread of about 1,000 years. And then the modern period from 1500 to 2000, or to the present. Um, I know you may be thinking, okay, 1500 doesn't seem very modern to me. This is Christopher Columbus, practically, or within his lifetime, Shakespeare. But if you think about the thousands and thousands of years of human history before that, the pre-modern period, the last 500 years actually is a pretty manageable chunk. We call from 1500 down to about 1750, 1780, the early modern period. Then you get the American and French revolutions and industrialization, things like that. And after that, just count centuries, 18th century, 19th century, and so forth. Um, so what I want to talk about now is pre-modern societies. I'll mainly use my examples from medieval Europe because it's what I'm most familiar with, and it will illustrate our points, hopefully. But in general and very, very broad terms, some of the things I'm going to talk about could be used to describe a lot of pre-modern societies in different ways. Um, yeah, this is to help a student, now in the 21st century, hopefully get some sense of the ways that pre-modern life before 1500, or even before industrialization, really before 1700, is very, very different from modern life. And you need to kind of get into this different context to fully understand the history of the times we're thinking about. So it's going to be three differences. One of them is going to be a difference in the economy of a pre-modern society, how people live and work and survive and thrive. One is going to be in the social structure, how people look at themselves and at each other and see their relationships among themselves. And one is going to be in the culture, right? The frameworks that define how they interpret the world around them and think about it and establish their values and things like that. So this first lecture, I'm going to talk about the economy. And the main characteristic of a pre-modern economy is that it is overwhelmingly agricultural, right? It's a farming economy. The vast majority of people and the vast majority of labor, the vast majority of wealth is tied up with farming, one way or another, growing the necessities of survival, your food, um, the plants out of which you will make your clothing, the trees and such out of which you will, harvesting the trees out of which you will make your homes, so on and so forth. The vast bulk of the population in a pre-modern society is engaged in agriculture. And that's something which is very, very different from modern society. In present-day America, I think it's something like 6% of the population is engaged in producing the food that the other 94% of the population eats. In medieval Europe, those proportions would have been reversed. You would have had 95% of the population engaged in farm work and only 5 or 6% of the population doing anything else, being clergy of the church, nobles, knights, merchants, craftsmen, anything else. The vast, vast, vast majority of people were engaged in agriculture one way or another. Um, why do you need to have so much of the population involved in agriculture? Well, farming is how you grow food, and the answer is that with the technology that's available and the various agricultural means of production that you have available, you don't have very high crop yields. That's a term you have in agriculture. Crop yields means for every seed you plant in the ground, how much is going to grow up that you can eat, right? Plant one seed, do you get just two? Do you get five? Do you get 10? Do you get 100? Crop yields in the Middle Ages tend to be pretty low, so you only have a pretty minimal surplus. A lot of what you harvest, you're going to have to save so that you can plant again next year to have a crop. And from what you're able to keep to eat, you have enough to feed yourself and not a whole lot left over, not a lot of surplus. So everybody really needs to be engaged in farming so that that 95% of the population is able to grow enough surplus food that you'll be able to feed the other 5%, your churchmen, your nobles, your merchants, and everybody else. Um, this means that also your productivity is going to be pretty low, right? Agriculture is very hard work, and you're going to have pretty low productivity, not a lot of surplus wealth getting generated here. This has a lot of ramifications down the line for people's lives, an awful lot of ramifications. One of them is going to be that people, the bulk of the population, lives on the brink of survival, right? A bad harvest, especially a couple of bad years of harvest in a row, and you could be looking at starvation. Right? You could be looking at just starving to death. Um, so life is very chancy. Death is never necessarily very far away. Life expectancies tend to be very low. Of course, you also don't have the advantages of modern medicine to allow people or assist people in recovering from diseases or injuries or infections. Um, so there are a lot of things which are causing people to reach their death much younger than they typically do in modern society. Average life expectancies tend to run in the mid 30s. That doesn't mean that people are growing old and dying of old age in their mid 30s, but it means that by the time you hit your mid 30s, there's about a 50-50 chance that something or other will have killed you, right? An infection, a disease of some kind, starvation, an accident, possibly violence, whatever. Um, Most people do not live to see their 40s, right? Um, and this has a lot of effects on the way society is going to work in turn. Um, with life expectancy that low, death is very familiar to a lot of people. That's going to be one factor. It means that if you think of the age breakdown of a given community, you don't have a lot of old people around, right? By comparison to modern times where retirees and the elderly are a very common presence, in a medieval village or an ancient Roman village or another, um, the elderly are fairly rare, actually, and much even more vulnerable, perhaps they are today without modern medical care. um, but if you think about when you're reading old texts, you'll often see this, advice insisting on, listen to gray hairs, honor the old, things like that. Those read in slightly different fashion when you realize how rare it is to have people around who have that gray hair and who have that life experience to be able to guide you and advise you and talk about what their experiences were and what they've seen before. Um, Decisions are being made by very young people. When people are inheriting kingdoms, you have rulers and nobles who quite often are young men or young women in some cases, queens and such, teenagers in many cases, making decisions about taxation and law and whether the kingdom should go to war, and they're being advised by other young men and women. Um, Not too different in age from themselves. So the age breakdown is very different as people tend to die young. It's also going to mean that married life and family life is going to be very different. It's going to have a major impact on the lives of women, will be another aspect there. Um, Life expectancies are that low. That means that if a woman becomes pregnant, there's a pretty much stronger chance that in modern times that pregnancy will result in a miscarriage or in a stillbirth, or if she gives birth to a living child, that child will not grow to adulthood to have children themselves. This will have major impact on demographics, right? Um, to maintain a stable population, zero population growth, neither growing nor declining. Um, Depending on exactly when and where you look, you wind up needing each woman to have an average of around 5 pregnancies, right? And that's an average, which means if someone is unable to become pregnant or becomes a nun or something like that, then the average for everybody else goes up by that much more. So it can get as high as 6 or 7 pregnancies per woman. Now, if you start doing the arithmetic, if you assume that a woman is capable of might become pregnant every other year or so, if there's a assumption, not really spoken about, just kind of assumed that she's, going to need to have at least 5 or 6 pregnancies over the course of her life, and if there's no guarantee that she herself is going to live much into her 30s, you do the arithmetic, count back from her life expectancy, and realize there's going to be a very heavy pressure laid on women that they would marry and start having children by the time they're done with their teens, and sometimes really as early as possible. In a lot of pre-modern societies, you find it to be standard to have teen marriage for females, not necessarily for males, um, and her primary role is going to be defined by motherhood because that's what guarantees the demographic continuation of the community, right? If the community doesn't, if its women don't get pregnant that often, then you're going to wind up with it shrinking away, and other communities around it that reproduce themselves more are going to wind up taking over. So it's demographic pressure much stronger than it is in modern times when we have much higher survival rates. Women will marry young, very often as soon as they get through puberty. Almost no, it varies depending on exactly when and where you are. In some cases, it'll be average marriage age for women at 13 or 14, and others as late as 19 or 20, but still quite young by modern standards. And the assumption again that motherhood is the primary role that the woman is going to have over the course of her life. That's going to mean not much interest in giving women opportunities for education, not much interest in giving them a role in economic or political activity. And in turn, this is going to result in the growth of the normalization of cultural mores, which tend to explain and justify this sort of a role for women. So that's a very gendered sort of a thing. That's why in a pre-modern society you hardly ever see values of female equality, right? It's just doesn't fit in with the economic realities of the survival of the community that you have in a pre-modern society. Um, and also the other thing, thinking of the economy itself, one major difference which is going to shape people's behavior is that wealth is going to be measured in terms of land, right? Your main source of prosperity is not how much money you have in the bank. A lot of this population never even touches cash necessarily, right? Money is not necessarily what they operate with, but rather the wealthy people are the people who control land, right? Especially farmland, productive land, and are able to use it. So there's an enormous amount of attention to territory and one's ability to access land by various means. Okay, so that's a quick glimpse of a pre-modern agricultural economy. It's overwhelmingly agricultural, which is going to mean almost everybody works in farming of one kind or another, and that's going to mean low life expectancies and the sort of gender roles, very strong pressure on demographic pressure on women for reproductive purposes, and also this tendency to shape behavior around the control of land in lots of ways. Next, I'll talk about social structure. Hold on for that.